You hear him before you see him. The knock of iron against oak once, twice, comes through 3 stone walls and still makes the stable boys scatter. They learn the pattern quickly, the ones who stay. The first knock is warning, the second is frustration, and the third means run. Nobody stays for the third. His name is Oberon, and he is coal-black and enormous and has been trying with admirable consistency to kick a hole through his stall since the 2nd week of October. The grooms call him the Devil's Carriage Horse. The estate accounts record him simply as one black Arabian stallion, acquisition value considerable. The Duke of Blackmere, who inherited him along with 600 acres and a title that felt 3 sizes too large, has not spoken the horse's name aloud since his father's funeral. He is the most beautiful thing on the property. He is also the most ungovernable. There is perhaps a connection. Philippa Harlow is a lady's maid no one looks at twice, which suits her perfectly because she has spent the better part of 3 years looking at everyone else. She knows which floorboards creak. She knows which grooms have been lying to the head man about Oberon's behavior and why. She knows something else too, something she overheard one autumn evening in the corridor outside the late Duke's study. And that particular knowledge has sat in her chest like a stone she cannot put down. Magnus Blackmore, 8th Duke of Blackmere, has a horse that won't be ridden, a title he didn't want, and a mother who has produced from somewhere a list of suitable young women he might consider marrying before the year is out. He finds the list considerably less interesting than the problem of Oberon. He finds the quiet maid he keeps not quite seeing considerably more interesting than he is prepared to admit. Some secrets keep themselves, others wait very patiently for the right person to ride in and shake them loose. This story is a work of romantic fiction, written for the quiet hours, for the people who still believe that patience and courage have their own sort of power. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you are tonight, the city, the hour, whether you've got something warm to drink. I read every single one. Philippa discovered early in her employment at Blackmere House that the most useful thing she could be was invisible, not unpleasant. That drew attention of the wrong kind, not servile. That drew contempt. Invisible was the precise middle distance, present when needed, absent when not, and absolutely silent about everything she observed in between. She had her father to thank for this. He had been a horse trainer, her father, which was really just another word for someone who understood that the loudest creature in any room was always the one most afraid. She thought of him every time she passed the stables. On the morning in question, a Monday mid-November with frost on the inner sill of every window in the east wing, Philippa was carrying a tea tray for her ladyship and attempting, with moderate success, not to spill it on the stairs. The tray held 1 pot of Darjeeling, a pair of shortbread biscuits that Mrs. Portman had wrapped in cloth against the cold, and a small jug of cream that had been warm exactly 12 minutes ago and was now making no promises. She heard Oberon before she reached the landing. The sound carried clearly through the stone, iron on wood, rhythmic and furious, and she paused for only a moment before continuing up the stairs. Nobody else paused. The remaining stable boys had, as she understood it, evolved past the ability to register this particular sound. It had become background noise, like the wind off the moors or the clock in the east corridor that was 20 minutes fast and refused all correction. Her ladyship's rooms were still dark. "The creature woke me at 4, said Lady Honora Blackmore from somewhere beneath a great quantity of coverlet, without moving. "Tell Slade if I hear it again, I shall personally arrange for the horse to be dispatched to someone who breeds sausages." "Very good, my lady," said Philippa. She arranged the tray, cracked the curtain approximately 2 inches. Her ladyship preferred dawn to enter the room the way bailiffs entered houses, slowly and with notice, and withdrew without a sound. In the corridor she stood still for 3 seconds. Below, somewhere in the direction of the stables, she heard Oberon strike the wall again. There was something particular about the rhythm this morning. She could not have explained it to anyone, but it did not sound like rage. It sounded like a question. The weekly meeting between Cornelius Slade and the Duke of Blackmere took place each Monday morning in the estate office, which smelled of old ledgers and a previous duke's pipe tobacco that had apparently saturated the walls permanently. Philippa knew this because the estate office was directly below her ladyship's sitting room, and the fireplace in that room shared a flue with the one below, which transmitted sound in both directions with remarkable clarity. She was not eavesdropping. She was laying a fire. "I'll be plain with you, Your Grace," Slade was saying. He was always plain. It was his defining characteristic, and he wore it like a badge. 3 grooms have quit since October. 2 more are asking for reassignment to the home farm. Henderson took a kick to the shoulder last Tuesday. It's healed, but his mother won't hear of him going near the Stallion again. I've a stable to run. I can't run it on goodwill and half the men. A silence. Then the Duke. "What are you recommending, Slade?" It was not a question. "Sell him, Your Grace, or..." A pause. "There are other options." "I am aware of the other options." Philippa set the tinder carefully. "He's the last horse your father chose personally," Slade said more quietly. "I know that means something, but the horse your father chose isn't there anymore. Whatever's in that stall now, it's not the same animal." Another silence, longer. "Give me until spring," the Duke said. "Your Grace, until spring, Slade." The fire caught. Philippa sat back on her heels and looked at it. She had seen Oberon precisely twice. Once when he arrived 2 years ago, when she had pressed her face against the fence post, like every other member of the household staff, too dignified to admit they were curious. He had been extraordinary then. Head-high, black coat sheened blue in the October light, moving with the particular arrogance of a creature that had never been given a reason to doubt itself. The second time was 3 weeks ago, past midnight, when she had slipped out to the kitchen garden for a bit of air after a long evening attending to Lady Honora's headache. The headache had required in succession cold compresses, a warmed compress, a glass of warm milk, a different glass of warm milk, a reading from a novel Lady Honora disliked, and a second reading from a novel she liked slightly less. Philippa had stood by the garden wall and heard from the distant stables a sound that stopped her entirely. It was not the kicking, it was the absence of it. For perhaps 10 minutes there had been nothing, and then once a soft sound, the kind a horse makes when it is not angry, only lonely, which are 2 things that can look identical from the outside. She had stood at the garden wall for quite some time after that. Slade's voice drifted up through the flue again, lower now, practical, talking about feed costs and farrier schedules. Philippa rose, dusted her hands, and went to collect the ash pail. On the table near the window, Lady Honora's correspondence sat in a neat stack. Philippa straightened it slightly without reading it. On top was a letter she had already seen the corner of last week, a solicitor's letter from a Mr. Aldous Cray in London regarding an introduction to a Miss Penelope Fairweather of Hertfordshire, who was understood to be quite accomplished. Philippa returned the stack to its precise original angle and carried the ash pail downstairs. There were in Blackmere House a number of people who had forgotten that Philippa Harlow existed. This was fine. It was, in fact, the operating principle on which she ran her life. She was 23, which the housemaids considered young, and which Lady Honora considered adequately practical, and she had the kind of face that was perfectly lovely when anyone thought to look at it properly, which most people did not. She had hazel eyes. Her father had called them river water eyes, which she had thought was a compliment and still couldn't quite decide, and light brown hair she kept pinned very firmly, and small, capable hands that had been doing other people's necessary work since she was 15. She did not mind the work. She minded occasionally the not being seen. They were different things, and she had learned to distinguish them carefully. She was invisible to the junior footman Thomas, who walked past her in the corridor 3 times a week and said, "Sorry, miss," each time as if she were furniture that had moved unexpectedly. She was invisible to the Duke of Blackmere, who had looked through her precisely 4 times since his return to the estate 6 months ago. Each time he had seen a housemaid-shaped space where she was standing and looked past it to whatever he actually wanted. She had not taken this personally. She had instead watched him. He was tall, taller than she had expected from the portrait in the gallery, which had been painted when he was perhaps 22, and had the fixed expression of a young man who had just been told he was sitting for a portrait, and considered this the least interesting way to spend an afternoon. The actual Duke of Blackmere was 30, or near it, and moved with the slightly compressed energy of a person who was rarely where he most wanted to be. He had dark hair, amber eyes, the color of old whiskey held to a window, and a face that arranged itself into something very nearly pleasant when he was in the stables, which was the only place she had ever seen him look completely like himself. He was, in the manner of the recently bereaved, doing a passable impression of a man who was not grieving. It was a reasonably convincing impression. The horse was not fooled. But then, horses rarely were. On the Thursday of that same week, Philippa was returning from the village with Lady Honora's botanical tincture, for digestion, not nerves, her ladyship had specified, as if Philippa might otherwise start a rumour, when she took the path through the home paddock and saw the Duke standing at the fence outside Oberon's turnout. He was not doing anything. He was simply standing there. Oberon was at the far end of the paddock, head turned away, performing what Philippa privately thought of as his diplomatic non-engagement. The horse was not afraid of the Duke. He had moved once when the Duke appeared, a quick sideways step that expressed annoyance rather than fear. Now he was standing with his hindquarters approximately pointed at his owner and affecting a strong interest in the gatepost. Philippa slowed her pace without meaning to. The Duke said something. She was too far to hear, and the horse's ears moved once, that was all. Then Oberon went back to the gatepost, clearly considering the conversation concluded. The Duke turned from the fence and nearly walked directly into Philippa. She stepped back. The tincture bottle made a small apologetic sound. "I beg your pardon," he said reflexively, the furniture in unexpected place reflex, and then he actually looked at her, which was sufficiently unusual that she registered it. "Not at all, Your Grace," she said. She maintained the exact expression of pleasant, practiced invisibility. "My apologies for being in the path." He looked at her for a moment, then at the stables, then at the paddock. "You work in the house," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. Lady Honora's maid." He nodded once, the way people nod when they have established a category for something and can now stop thinking about it. Philippa had watched this particular nod from several employers. It meant, "Filed, thank you, carry on." She carried on. Behind her she heard him walk back toward the stables. She did not turn around. Her father had told her once that a frightened horse and a lonely horse made exactly the same sound. The trick was standing still long enough to find out which one you were dealing with. This had struck her at 9 years old as both obvious and profound. Now it struck her as simply practical. She rose before 5 on the following Saturday, which was no great achievement since she rose before 5 every day. The difference was that this particular Saturday, instead of going to Lady Honora's corridor to wait for the bell, she put on her warmest cloak, tucked her hair under a cap and went out the servants' entrance into the dark. The frost had hardened overnight. Her boots crunched across the yard with a sound she found herself flinching at, though there was no one to hear it. The grooms didn't start until 6, and the stable boys not until past. The east wing was dark. The main house was dark. Even the kitchen was only a faint glow of banked coals through the far window. The stable smelled of straw and horse and cold leather, and something mineral like stone. She liked it. She had always liked it. It smelled like her father's coat. Oberon was at the far end of his stall, and she heard him shift his weight when she entered the corridor, the particular double beat of a large animal adjusting to an unexpected presence. She did not go to him immediately. She stood at the entrance, between the groom's tack room and the empty stall to his left, and she waited. He knocked once. She did not move. A minute passed, perhaps 2. She heard him stop moving. She moved then, not toward him, but sideways, toward the empty stall. She sat on the mounting block just inside the door, tucked her hands into her cloak, and looked at nothing in particular. The sound of her own breathing, the distant hoot of something in the oaks. Oberon's breath, slow and enormous, like bellows. She did not look at him. He looked at her. She could feel it, that particular awareness, the way large animals observe unfamiliar small ones, without looking at him directly. After perhaps 5 minutes, he moved, not away, sideways toward the partition that divided his stall from the empty one. She still did not look at him. His nose appeared over the partition. He exhaled onto the top of her cap with the decisive air of a scientist confirming a hypothesis. "Good morning," she said, to the middle distance. He withdrew his nose and then, after a brief consideration, put it back. This was by any measure progress. She sat with him for an hour. She did not touch him. She did not try to approach or produce treats or make any of the well-intentioned overtures she had watched the stable boys attempt, the extended hand, the cajoling voice, the increasingly desperate offers of apple. She simply sat, because sitting was something she was very good at, and waited because that too was something she had learned to do without impatience. The cold settled in through the flagstones and up through her boot soles, and she ignored it. A mouse crossed the far end of the corridor with the industrious confidence of someone who owned the place after midnight. Somewhere beyond the walls, the moors sighed, a low carrying sound, the breath of open ground, and Oberon's ears moved toward it and then back to her. That backward tilt was, she thought, a small thing, the sort of thing nobody would notice unless they were looking for it. She was always looking for it. When the sky began to lighten blue-grey through the high stable window, she stood, brushed down her skirts, and said same time tomorrow. Then, in the same voice she used to inform her ladyship that her morning tea was ready. Matter of fact, nothing to negotiate. Oberon, for his part, watched her go with an expression of philosophical reserve that she found deeply familiar, though she could not immediately place where she had seen it before. She did this for 6 days. On the 7th day she brought a carrot, mostly to give herself something to do with her hands. He ate it in approximately 1 second and then stood very close to the partition wall with an air of pointed expectation that reminded her strongly of Lady Honora waiting for the second biscuit. She laughed. The sound surprised her. Too loud for the early morning, a real laugh rather than the careful, quiet sort she produced on normal occasions. She pressed her hand over her mouth immediately. Oberon's ears swiveled toward the sound. "Sorry," she told him. "You reminded me of someone." His ears stayed up, curious, not alarmed. She moved without planning it from the empty stall to the front of his stall and held out her hand, and he dropped his nose into it with the air of a creature who had decided, after due deliberation, to extend a professional courtesy. She stood very still and breathed and felt the warm weight of him against her palm. "There," she said. "That wasn't so difficult." He breathed on her sleeve. She was fairly certain this constituted agreement. On the 8th morning, she brought a halter. On the 9th morning, she tacked him up. On the 10th morning, and a Tuesday clear and cold, the paddock empty and frost-white and absolutely nobody's business, she rode him. He was, it turned out, extraordinary. She had suspected it from the way he moved, but knowing a thing and experiencing it were different in all the ways that mattered. He had a collected trot that made her feel like she was sitting inside a clock, every movement precise and regulated. He had a canter that was not smooth exactly, but vast, the stride so large that the fence posts passed by like slow thoughts. He ran because he chose to, and he collected because she asked him to, and she understood, with a clarity that came from the body rather than the mind, that nobody had ever actually listened to him before. She brought him back to a walk and sat quietly, her hands loose on the reins. From the direction of the house, and specifically from the upper window of the east wing, she had the distinct feeling of being watched. She turned once and looked up at the window. She could not quite see who was there, only a shape, tall, still unmistakably awake at 5:30 on a Tuesday morning. She turned back to the paddock and collected Oberon into a proper trot and pretended she hadn't noticed. He noticed she was pretending. She could feel it in the slight tension that came through the reins, a horse's version of a raised eyebrow. "Yes, all right," she told him. "I'm aware." He maintained the raised eyebrow trot for another circuit, and she let him because they both deserved it. Magnus had not slept well since July. This was, he was aware, a fairly common feature of grief, the way it redistributed itself through the night hours, filing everything neatly into the dark so that it could be dealt with between 2 and 4 in the morning when no rational defenses were available. He had read about this. He had not found the reading particularly comforting, but it had given him something to do in the sleepless parts of the night, beyond staring at the ceiling of a room he associated, unreasonably but persistently, with the fact that his father used to stand at the window of the neighboring study and watch the stars. He was standing at his window on Tuesday morning, not looking at stars because the sun was already coming up in a spectacular indifference to his schedule, when he saw the maid in the paddock. He had seen her twice before, once in the corridor outside Lady Honora's rooms, where she had been carrying something and had stepped out of his path with the neat economy of a person who had been stepping out of people's paths for a very long time. Once in the home paddock, where she had startled him, and he had been ungracious about it, and she had been excessively polite about it, which he had felt, in retrospect, was a fair distribution of blame. He had not in either instance stopped to look at her properly. He was looking at her now. She was on Oberon. This was not possible. Slade had declared Oberon unrideable in August. 3 experienced riders, including Slade himself, who had broken more horses than most men had owned, had agreed. There had been a formal assessment, which Magnus had not attended because the outcome seemed obvious, and he found it difficult to watch the horse that his father had loved be declared a failure. The assessment had concluded, Stallion is not suitable for riding and may present a danger to personnel. The woman in the paddock had apparently missed this memo. She was sitting Oberon like she had been doing it for years. Not rigid, not the clamped, managing posture of someone keeping a difficult horse in line. Loose, easy. The way you sat something that was willing. Oberon's ears were forward. His entire body had the expression, horses had expressions, Magnus had always known this, his father had taught him, of a creature who was, for the first time in months, exactly where it wanted to be. Magnus stood at his window and watched for 20 minutes. He was not, he told himself, watching the woman. He was watching the horse. He was watching Oberon move in a collected canter that he hadn't known the animal possessed, had not known because nobody had found a way to ask him nicely, apparently. He was watching his father's horse, the one that nobody could touch, the one Slade wanted to sell, the one Magnus had been bargaining for with the word spring because he couldn't say, I'm not ready to give him up too, move across the paddock with an ease that was, frankly, making him feel a complicated number of feelings. She turned once and looked up at his window. He stepped back slightly, which was absurd, because he was a duke and it was his window. And the act of a grown man stepping back from his own window at the sight of a maid looking up at it was not something he particularly wanted to examine. He stepped back anyway. He went downstairs at 6:30, which was 2 hours earlier than usual, and 45 minutes before Mrs. Portman expected him for breakfast. She was in the stable corridor when he arrived. Not hiding exactly, but there was a quality to her positioning beside the tack room with a halter in her hands and an expression of perfect professional composure that suggested she had known he was coming and had made a decision about how to receive him. He stopped at the entrance to the corridor. Your Grace, she said, not flustered, not guilty, not excessively innocent, which would have been the most suspicious option, just present and appropriately addressed. You rode the horse, he said. She looked at him steadily. Yes, Your Grace. The horse no one could ride. People kept trying to ride him, she said, which was technically a non-answer. I sat with him. He waited to see if there was more. There's a difference, she added, apparently deciding he needed clarification. He looked past her, to Oberon's stall. The horse had his head over the door and was regarding Magnus with an expression that could only be described as smug. Magnus had the brief, vivid impression that Oberon was waiting to see how this went. You've been coming here in the mornings, he said. Yes, Your Grace. No apology. A simple acknowledgement, the kind that didn't ask for his opinion on the matter. For how long? 10 mornings. He did some arithmetic. He looked at Oberon. The horse continued to be smug. What's your name? He said. She looked at him, the first time she had looked at him directly rather than at a polite, maid-appropriate angle 2 inches to the left of his face, and something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, quite. Something closer to recalibration. Philippa Harlow, Lady Honora's maid, Your Grace. I know who you work for, he said, and then felt that this came out more sharply than intended. He revised. I didn't know your name. Most people don't, she said, in a tone so perfectly neutral that he couldn't tell whether it was a complaint or a simple statement of fact. He thought for a second that it might be both. He looked again at Oberon, who had now begun chewing on the door frame in a way that was destructive and perfectly deliberate. Could you stop him doing that, Magnus said, or has this partnership developed to a point where he does whatever he likes? She turned and said calmly, "Oberon, stop." The horse stopped. Magnus looked at her. She turned back, and something at the corner of her mouth, just the corner, moved almost imperceptibly. "Would you show me," he said, "what you did? How you sat with him?" She considered him for a moment in a way that was very slightly longer than was strictly appropriate for a maid, considering a request from a duke. Then she said, "Yes, Your Grace," and moved past him toward the paddock. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He did not announce these visits. He simply appeared in the paddock at 5:30, which Philippa had learned to interpret as not here for the horse, or rather, here for the horse, yes, but also here because the stables were the only place in Blackmere House where the furniture didn't look like the previous duke had bought it, and the clocks didn't run 20 minutes fast, and nothing had been arranged according to a plan he hadn't made. She did not point this out. She taught him what she knew, which was not technique exactly, because technique suggested a body of knowledge that could be transferred systematically, and what she actually had was a method that was mostly patience and silence, and a willingness to be wrong about what a horse needed and start again. She showed him how she approached the stall, how she moved, not slowly exactly, but with intention, which was different, how she breathed when Oberon was restless. He was a quick study. She had not expected this. Dukes, in her experience, had two modes in unfamiliar territory: confident and wrong, or confused and offended to be confused. Magnus Blackmore was neither. He watched very carefully, and he asked specific questions. And when she corrected him, and she corrected him twice, once about the angle of his approach, and once about the pressure of the rein, he took the correction without ceremony. On the third morning, Oberon let him in, not onto his back. That was a different conversation, and the horse was making clear it would happen on his own schedule, but into the stall, which had not happened since August. Magnus stood just inside the door, and Oberon stood at the back, and they regarded each other with the mutual wariness of two stubborn individuals who have been told by a third party that they are supposed to get along. Philippa stayed outside. She watched through the slats. Magnus said nothing for a long time. Then he said very quietly, something she couldn't hear. Oberon's ears moved. He took one step forward. She looked away, because this was not something she should be watching. The morning after that, they tacked up together and took Oberon to the paddock. Magnus rode him at a walk, just a walk, for 20 minutes, Oberon's ears swiveling with each step, as though uncertain whether to maintain the dignified reserve or abandon it in favor of something more satisfying. The air was sharp with coming rain, and the paddock grass had that particular silver look it got in December. Not quite frost, not quite dew, something in between that crunched faintly underfoot. Magnus's breath clouded. Oberon's clouded. Philippa, standing at the fence with her fingers hooked through the top rail, watched both of them and felt something settle in her chest, some small anxious thing that she had been carrying without quite naming it, set down without ceremony. Magnus had amber eyes. She noticed this in the thin morning light, because it was impossible not to, because they were the color of the amber pendant her mother had owned, the one that caught the sun and turned the world orange for an instant. And a quality of attention that was unusual, perhaps the most unusual thing about him, the quality of paying attention to a thing entirely while it was in front of him. Oberon felt it. She could see it in the horse's walk, the slight loosening. She was thinking precisely about nothing in particular when Magnus said from Oberon's back, "You grew up with horses." "My father was a trainer." She had learned to answer direct questions directly, which was a useful skill with people who asked them honestly. Where? Devonshire originally. He worked at several estates. He died 4 years ago. He looked at her, a brief, proper look rather than the convenient furniture glance. "I'm sorry. Thank you," she said. And then, because she couldn't quite help it, "Oberon reminds me of a horse my father had trouble with once. A grey, supposed to be ungovernable. Turned out she was just bored." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "And Oberon?" "Both," she said. "Bored and sad, I think, though they're quite similar from the outside." He was quiet after that for the rest of the circuit. When he dismounted and handed her the reins, he said, "Miss Harlow, thank you." Nobody had thanked her for anything in approximately 2 years. She was struck for a moment by not knowing where to put it. "You're welcome, Your Grace," she said, and took the reins and busied herself with Oberon's girth, which did not require adjustment, but gave her something to do with her hands. She heard him leave. She pressed her forehead briefly against Oberon's neck, and he stood very still and permitted this, which was more comfort than she had any right to ask for. "Don't get ideas," she told the horse. He exhaled long and warm on her shoulder, which was not an answer to the question she had asked. Lady Honora arrived in the stables 3 days later. Not personally. Lady Honora had not visited the stables in the 18 months Philippa had been in her employ, and she was not about to start now. She arrived via Mrs. Portman, who appeared at the kitchen garden wall at 7 in the morning to inform Philippa that her ladyship required her immediately, and also that her ladyship had seen something from her window, and that there was a quality to the phrase, "Her ladyship has seen something," that did not suggest a pleasant conversation ahead. Philippa untacked Oberon. He permitted this with a martyred expression she found very relatable, and went in. Lady Honora was at her writing desk, which was her position of authority. She received tradespeople, solicitors, and difficult conversations from the writing desk. She received friends, of which there were a modest number, her son, and small children from the armchair by the window. The writing desk meant, "We are having a conversation that is not about comfort." "Philippa," said Lady Honora. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, silver-haired and exact, with the manner of someone who had spent decades being correct and found it a satisfying occupation. "I will not pretend I haven't seen you in the paddock." "My lady?" "With my son." "Yes, my lady. His Grace has been learning the horse's method." "I am aware what you have been doing," Lady Honora said very calmly. "And I am aware that it is not in itself inappropriate. You are a member of this household, and my son has asked for your assistance with an estate matter. That is entirely within the bounds of propriety." She paused. The pause was pointed. "However," Philippa waited. "However," Lady Honora repeated, "my son is grieving, and grief is the condition in which people are most susceptible to the impression that things are different from what they are. I would not wish any member of my household to take advantage of that susceptibility, even a small impeccable pause, inadvertently." Philippa kept her expression pleasant and present and absolutely uninformative. "I understand, my lady," she said. "Good," said Lady Honora. "There is also the matter of his upcoming correspondence with Miss Penelope Fairweather's family, which I expect will be resolved by the new year, and which I would not wish to see complicated. He has responsibilities, an estate, a title." She set down her pen. "You understand what I'm saying?" "Perfectly, my lady." She did not mention Oberon again. She said it all with the words around it, in the way that Regency society was full of people who said everything with the words around the thing, and Philippa sat and received each unstated sentence and gave nothing back, because she had had years of practice and because she was not going to give Lady Honora the satisfaction of a reaction. She returned to her duties. She did not go to the stables that morning. She sat with it through the afternoon, the particular quality of being warned off something you had not yet admitted wanting, and she sat with it through the evening while she dressed Lady Honora for dinner, and she sat with it in the dark of her room afterward. And then she thought about something else, because there was something else, and it had been there for 6 months, and she had been managing it the way you manage a stone in your boot on a long walk, by adjusting your gait and hoping the path ends before it causes real damage. She had heard in October of the year before, the night before the old Duke of Blackmere's riding accident, which everyone called an accident, which the inquest had returned as an accident. A conversation. She had not been listening. She had been returning from an errand to Mr. Slade's office, a letter from Lady Honora about the hay stores, and the corridor outside the late Duke's study had been dark, and she had slowed her steps because there were voices, and she had not wanted to interrupt. Lord Barnaby Blackmore, the cousin, a thin-lipped man who had attended every family occasion for a year, with the energy of someone taking measurements, had been speaking to a man whose voice she had not known then, but which she had since identified as belonging to Mr. Aldous Cray, the estate solicitor. They had been discussing Oberon, not in the way people discussed difficult horses, in the way people discussed tools. The horse knows the trail to Greystone Falls, Lord Barnaby had said. He's done it in every weather. The question is whether a sudden noise, a pistol, a firecracker, something, at the right moment, on that trail. She had moved away before she heard the rest. She had told herself then that she had misunderstood. She was a maid. She had no certainty, no proof. She was a maid, and he was a cousin of a duke, and the inquest had said, an accident. The old duke had died the following afternoon, a fall from Oberon on the trail to Greystone Falls. The horse had returned to the stable, riderless and wild, and had not permitted anyone near him since. She had managed the stone in her boot for 6 months. She was not sure she could manage it for 6 more. She told him on a Friday. This was not planned. It was the result of a specific sequence of events that she had not arranged and could not entirely have avoided. Lord Barnaby Blackmore arrived at Blackmere House on a Thursday afternoon with no advance notice, a leather travelling case, and the manner of someone who was entirely at ease in rooms that belonged to other people. He embraced Lady Honora with the warmth of a cousin who needed to be liked. He shook Magnus's hand with the warmth of a cousin who needed to be trusted. He looked at Philippa when she crossed the hall with her ladyship's evening wrap, with the look of a man checking whether a face means something to him. She kept her expression perfectly composed and walked past him without altering her pace by half a step. But she could not sleep that night. She lay in the dark and listened to Oberon's distant hoofbeats. He was restless too, she noticed, which she did not believe was coincidence. And she thought about the phrase at the right moment, on that trail, and she thought about the fact that Lord Barnaby Blackmore had now been in the house for 12 hours and had spent 40 minutes alone with the Duke reviewing estate matters. She was not a woman who made dramatic decisions. She had spent 23 years making careful, measured, survival-oriented ones. She had learned early that dramatic decisions cost more than they returned, that the impulse to act on principle was a luxury most often available to people who could afford the consequences. But there was a quality to lying still in the dark with a stone in your boot, knowing what you knew, and feeling it press harder each day that eventually stopped being manageable. Lord Barnaby's face in the hallway, that measuring look, she had seen that look before, on a man her father had once warned her about, a man who counted rooms when he walked through a house that wasn't his, the look of someone taking inventory. She got up at 4:30. She went to the stables. She was brushing Oberon's forelock. He had opinions about this, expressed via extended lower lip of disapproval, which she ignored, when she heard Magnus's boots on the stable floor. He stopped in the doorway. "You're early," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." He came in. He looked at Oberon, who stopped objecting to the brushing and adopted his best neutral face for the Duke's arrival. Magnus stroked the stallion's nose, and Oberon permitted this with the dignity of a senior official, tolerating a well-meaning introduction. "Lord Barnaby came yesterday," Magnus said to the horse. "Yes, Your Grace. He has suggested I revisit the inquest records. My father's accident." He paused. "Apparently there is a question about the estate inheritance that requires clarification. Whether my father had updated his will in the last year." Another pause, shorter. "Lord Barnaby seems quite interested in the will." She stopped brushing. "Your Grace," she said. He looked at her. There were, she understood, approximately 2 options. She could say nothing, Your Grace, and return to the brushing and carry the stone in her boot for the rest of her life, or until Lord Barnaby's access to estate matters went somewhere she did not want to think about, or she could say what she knew. She had never been good at the first option. Her father had said this about her, with a mixture of pride and mild alarm. "Pip, you are constitutionally incapable of leaving things as they are. I need to tell you something," she said. "I should have told you sooner. I didn't because I wasn't certain it was my place, and I wasn't certain what I had heard, and I was—" She stopped. "I was afraid you wouldn't believe me." He was very still. She told him all of it. The corridor, the voices, the trail to Greystone Falls, a sudden noise, the timing, the way Oberon had come back wild. She told it plainly, without embellishment, in the order it had happened. And when she finished, she looked at his face and could not read it. He had the quality she had noticed on the first morning. the quality of full attention, but the attention was currently directed inward, and she couldn't see where it was going. "I have no proof," she said. "I know that." "You heard this the night before," he said. "Yes." "And you've held it for 6 months." "Yes." She met his gaze directly. "I'm sorry, I should have—" "You were a maid," he said, not unkindly, "who had overheard a conversation that, if reported, could be disbelieved and used to remove you from your position, and possibly worse. You made a rational calculation in a situation that was not designed for you to succeed in." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not criticizing you." She let out a breath that was not quite a sound. He turned back to Oberon. The horse watched him steadily, one white star catching the pale lantern light above the stall door, his coal-black coat still against the hay. "He came back terrified," Magnus said softly. I thought it was grief, that he missed my father. I thought horses did that." He paused. "He was terrified." "Yes," she said. "I think so." Magnus was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I need to speak with Cray." "Mr. Cray came with Lord Barnaby," Philippa said. He turned and looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I noticed that too." She was dismissed from the house by noon. This was Lady Honora's work, swift, clean, executed through Mrs. Portman with the language of "your services are no longer required at this time," which was, Philippa understood, the polite version of "my nephew has complained, and the path of least resistance leads here." She was given her wages through the end of the month and told there was a carrier to the coaching inn at 2 o'clock. She packed her bag. It was not a large bag. She had not acquired much. She was in the kitchen yard waiting when she heard Oberon, not the sound of frustration, not iron on wood. She heard him in the paddock, a collected canter, rhythmic and purposeful, coming toward the house at a pace that suggested someone had a destination in mind, and considered 2 o'clock an excellent deadline. She turned. Magnus came through the yard gate on Oberon's back. He pulled up in the cobbled yard with exactly the controlled energy she had taught him. Light hands, Oberon's hindquarters collected under him, ears forward and cooperative. He looked, on the horse, like the portrait in the gallery would have looked if the portrait's subject had been allowed to move. He looked at her bag. "They told you to go," he said. "Yes." "My mother told you to go." "I was given official notice by Mrs. Portman." He dismounted and stood in the yard with the reins in his hand, and Oberon stood beside him, with an expression she could only describe as "finally," which was, she thought, quite the editorial for a horse. "I spoke with Cray," Magnus said. He spoke with his usual economy, facts in order, no performance. Under some encouragement, he was prepared to confirm sufficient detail. "Lord Barnaby has been escorted from the property, pending a formal inquiry. Cray has agreed to provide a written account to the magistrate's office. The matter is no longer private." She gripped the handle of her bag. "You did the right thing," he said, "in telling me. I want to be clear about that." "Thank you, Your Grace. I also want to be clear," he said with the slightest difficulty, "that your dismissal is rescinded." She looked at him. "That is within my authority," he continued, which she suspected he was saying for his own benefit as much as hers. "The dismissal was issued on grounds I do not sanction. You are, if you choose to remain, a member of this household, in whatever capacity is most appropriate." He stopped. There was something behind the words, something that a person standing 6 inches further away might not have noticed. "I am aware that my mother will have a great deal to say about this. I am also finding, somewhat to my surprise, that I am less interested in what my mother has to say than I was 6 months ago." Oberon nudged Magnus's shoulder. "Yes, all right," Magnus said to the horse. "I'm coming to it." She almost laughed. He looked at her, and the look was different from any of the previous looks. Not the furniture glance, not the categorizing nod, not even the careful attention he paid to the horse. This was a look that saw her. All of it. The capable hands, the river water eyes, the 6 months of silence and 3 weeks of mornings and 1 moment in the paddock, when she had laughed at a horse who reminded her of a duchess. "I don't want you to go," he said simply. "I recognize this puts you in a position that is not straightforward, and I am not asking you to resolve it now, but I wanted to say it plainly. My household is poorer without you in it, and I am—" He seemed to be choosing words with some care. "I am not yet ready to know what that means, but I know it is true." Oberon exhaled on her shoulder, warm and deliberate and absolutely editorializing. She set the bag down. "You'll need to speak to your mother," she said. "I know. And there will need to be a proper arrangement, a title or a role or—" She stopped. "Something appropriate." "I know," he said again. "I'll sort it." A pause. "Give me a week." "A week," she agreed. She picked up Oberon's reins. He leaned into it, easy and familiar, and walked him back toward the stable, and Magnus walked beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while, because the quiet between them had become the kind that doesn't need filling. At the stable door, she handed him the reins. "For the record," she said, "I taught you to ride him, not the other way around." He looked at her, and the amber eyes caught the pale winter light, and the corner of his mouth moved. "Duly noted," he said. Magnus spent a week being extremely forthright with his mother, which was not a natural state for him, and produced in Lady Honora a silence of approximately 36 hours, followed by a tersely expressed acknowledgement that the situation was unprecedented, but not technically without historical parallel. He sent for Mr. Aldous Cray's replacement, a solicitor from York, selected entirely on the basis of having no prior connection to Lord Barnaby, and began the process of rearranging several things in the estate accounts that Lord Barnaby had been quietly rearranging in a different direction. Lord Barnaby himself was, by January, a problem for the magistrate. Philippa gave her account in writing twice, once formally, and once to a rather surprised justice of the peace who had not previously received a statement from a lady's maid that was better organized than most legal briefs. Philippa remained at Blackmere House. In what capacity precisely was a matter of some creative renegotiation, and the new year brought with it a careful conversation and then a second, somewhat less careful one, and by February there were arrangements in place that satisfied no one completely, but which managed in the end to satisfy the two people who mattered most. Lady Honora eventually acknowledged that the situation was, if nothing else, economical in its resolution. The estate required someone competent who understood both the household and the horse, and Philippa, whatever else she was undeniably that. Lady Honora said this in a tone that suggested she found the entire business exasperating, which was, Philippa had come to understand, her ladyship's version of a concession. She still rose before 5. On the first clear morning of March, she went to the paddock as she always did, and Oberon was already there. Turned out at first light, his coal-black coat sheened blue in the early sun, one white star on his forehead, catching the light like a small, firm declaration. He came to her at the gate without being called, which he had started doing in December, and which she took as the highest possible compliment. Magnus came out at 5:30, which was earlier than usual. She did not ask why. He stood beside her at the fence, and they watched the light come up over the moors, slow, golden, filling the frost-white paddock in stages the way good things often came, gradually, and then all at once. Oberon stood between them and the light, entirely at his ease, in the manner of a horse who has arranged exactly the morning he wanted and considers the matter settled. The shadows where romance lives.